Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into a topic today that carries some serious weight in international relations:
Definitely a heavyweight.
humanitarian intervention.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
if you're prepping for the UPSC, especially if you've got international relations as your focus, this is going to be a key one for you.
Hmm.
It pops up all the time in the syllabus.
Oh, for sure.
Now, on the surface, it might seem pretty straightforward, right?
Right.
Using military force to stop human rights abuses in another country.
Yeah.
But trust me,
Yeah.
the deeper we dig, the more you realize
It's anything but.
exactly
Yeah.
anything but simple.
Yeah.
So let's
Yeah.
break it down.
Right.
And we've got a great source today that really digs into this whole concept of humanitarian intervention.
Yeah, a really fascinating look at how the whole idea has evolved over time. I mean, intervening in another country's affairs, all in the name of humanity.
Right.
It's a tricky business.
For sure. It makes you wonder, was it always truly about saving lives, or
Yeah.
were there other motives at play? Were there interventions with a humanitarian angle even before we had a term for it?
That's exactly it. The term humanitarian intervention might be relatively recent, but the idea of intervening in another country with a humanitarian element has been around for centuries, really.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Think about the Battle of Navarino Bay back in 1827. British and French forces just wiped out the Turkish and Egyptian fleets
Wow.
to help Greece gain independence.
Mm.
Now, you could argue there were humanitarian aspects to it.
All right.
Obviously, people were suffering under Ottoman rule.
Yeah.
But the main drivers,
Yeah.
power plays, maintaining regional stability, keeping the balance of power in check. It wasn't this purely altruistic mission. And that pattern, you see it cropping up again and again throughout history.
Yeah.
India stepping into East Pakistan in 1971, which of course led to the creation of Bangladesh,
Right.
and Vietnam going into Cambodia in 1978 to oust the Khmer Rouge. Both had humanitarian elements, no doubt, but they weren't framed as humanitarian interventions at the time.
So then what changed?
Yeah.
What was the turning point where this idea of humanitarian intervention as a concept, as a term, really took hold?
Well, the end of the Cold War was a big one.
Okay.
There was this sudden surge of optimism, everyone talking about a new world order where international norms, cooperation, and morality would finally take center stage. Figures like Kofi Annan, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, they were all championing this idea that human rights, they're not just a domestic issue.
Right.
They're everyone's responsibility.
It's a global concern.
Absolutely. And that shift in thinking had a huge impact on how interventions were perceived and justified.
That's fascinating. So the 1990s, we saw this surge in humanitarian crises. I mean, was it just a coincidence? Or were there deeper forces at play? Our source material kind of points to two camps on this.
That's a great point. Yeah, there's this ongoing debate. Were these crises mainly caused by internal problems within these countries? Like corrupt governments, economic struggles, ethnic tensions? Or were they largely the result of external forces, like the legacy of colonialism, pressures from globalization, or even policies imposed by international institutions? It's a really complex question.
It is. It is. So let's dig into those motives for intervention a little bit more. Our source material outlines 4 key factors that explain why countries became so much more willing to intervene for those humanitarian reasons in the 1990s. One factor is this idea that sometimes national interest just happens to align with humanitarian concern.
Right, exactly.
So it's not always pure altruism.
Right.
There's a strategic angle in there somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a big part of the debate, isn't it? How much of it is genuinely about helping others and how much is about advancing your own agenda?
Yeah.
Take the U.S. intervention in Haiti, for example. Yes, there were genuine humanitarian concerns, a brutal dictatorship, people fleeing for their lives.
Yeah.
But it was also about stemming the flow of Haitian refugees heading towards the U.S. national interest and humanitarian concern, kind of intertwined.
Right, right. Okay, so what were those other factors? You said 4, so what's number 2?
Public pressure.
Okay.
It's huge. The CNN effect, as they call it. That 2047 news coverage of these humanitarian crises, it just completely transformed the game. Suddenly, people were seeing these horrific events unfolding in their living rooms, and it created this immense pressure on governments to do something, to act. You couldn't ignore it anymore.
It's hard to turn away when you're confronted with those images and those stories day after day.
Exactly. It really struck a chord with the public. And that public pressure, it became a powerful force driving intervention.
Makes sense. Okay, what about the third factor?
The third one is all about the global power dynamics after the Cold War.
Okay.
With the Soviet Union gone, the U.S. emerged as the sole superpower, and it made it a lot easier to build consensus for intervention. You didn't have that same level of rivalry and gridlock in the international system.
Right. So the global political landscape was primed for it in a way.
Exactly. And that had a big impact on how readily countries were willing to consider intervention as an option.
Okay, so we've got national interest, public pressure, shifting power dynamics.
Yeah.
What's the fourth factor?
The fourth factor is the growing global acceptance of human rights as a fundamental bedrock of ethical behavior, both for individuals and for states. This wasn't always the case, but in the post-Cold War era, you see this increasing emphasis on human rights as a universal value. Leaders like Kofi Annan, Bill Clinton, they really pushed this idea, and it created this sense of moral obligation, a sense that countries had a duty to step in when human rights were being violated, regardless of where it was happening.
So that's where we start to see the rise of what some call humanitarian intervention.
Exactly.
But then, as you mentioned earlier, 9/11 happens.
Yeah.
The war on terror.
All right.
And that seems to shift things again.
It definitely did.
Oh.
The war on terror really threw a wrench in the whole conversation about humanitarian intervention. Suddenly, there was this perception that maybe there had been too many interventions. And the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, they really fueled that sentiment.
They were highly controversial, for sure.
Yeah. Now, it's important to note that those wars weren't strictly humanitarian interventions in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
But they were partly justified on humanitarian grounds.
Right.
It was about fighting terrorism, sure, but also about liberating people from oppressive regimes. And that blurring of lines between fighting terrorism and promoting human rights, it made things a lot more complicated.
Definitely muddy the waters a bit. And didn't the war on terror also cause this shift from just humanitarian intervention to something a little bit different?
Absolutely. The war on terror really intensified this debate about ulterior motives.
Right.
Were these interventions truly about helping others? Or were they a cover for power projection, for asserting dominance? And that debate, it led to a shift from humanitarian intervention to what some call liberal interventionism.
Okay, so what's the distinction there?
Well, liberal interventionism takes it a step further. It's not just about responding to immediate crises, it's about actively promoting liberal values, democracy, human rights, free markets around the world. It's this belief that these values are universal and that established liberal states have a duty to intervene when those values are threatened, even if it means regime change, even if it means nation building.
So the goals expanded. It became about more than just providing immediate relief.
Exactly. And that brought a whole new set of challenges and critiques to the table.
Yeah, I can imagine. So even with the best intentions, this whole idea of intervening for humanitarian reasons, it's fraught with challenges.
Oh, absolutely. It's a moral and political minefield. And one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest critiques, is this problem of selectivity. Why are some crises deemed worthy of international action while others are largely ignored?
Yeah, it's a really valid point. What makes one crisis more deserving of attention than another? Is it about media coverage? Is it about strategic interests? Is it about cultural biases? There are so many factors at play, and it's hard to escape this sense that sometimes the decision to intervene is based on factors that have very little to do with humanitarian concerns.
Absolutely. It raises some really tough questions about fairness and equality. Are some lives considered more valuable than others? It's a question that we need to confront head on, and it's a question that's central to understanding the complexities of humanitarian intervention.
We've covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah.
And it's clear that humanitarian intervention is so much more complex than it might seem at first glance. To really understand it, we need to look at specific examples. So let's shift our focus now to a case study that really highlights these complexities, the tiny nation of East Timor.
East Timor, also known as Timor-Leste,
Right.
a country with a history full of struggle and resilience.
Yeah. For those who might not be familiar with East Timor's story, can you give us a little bit of background?
Sure. For over 300 years, it was a Portuguese colony. And then in 1975, Indonesia invaded, which triggered this brutal guerrilla war that lasted for decades. And it resulted in the deaths of a huge percentage of the population. I mean, it was a horrific conflict, just devastating.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and why this question of intervention is so important. So what eventually happened? How did this decades-long conflict come to an end?
It wasn't until 1999 that a UN-backed intervention finally took place.
Okay.
After years and years of violence. And ultimately, the intervention was successful.
Okay.
It stopped the bloodshed, and it paved the way for East Timor to finally gain its independence in 2002. But the road after independence, it hasn't been easy.
Not at all.
No. East Timor has faced a whole host of challenges. Ongoing factional violence, weak government institutions, a constant need for international aid. It's a reminder that intervention, even when it achieves its immediate goals, often comes with these long-term commitments. And there are always unforeseen difficulties that arise. Nation building is a long and complicated process.
Yeah, it really underscores that intervention is not a quick fix.
It's not. It's a long game with a lot of moving parts.
So we've explored the history, the motives, the ethical dilemmas, and we've even looked at a real-world case study. This has been an incredibly insightful journey so far, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
We've just dipped our toes in the water.
Exactly. But we're going to take a quick break.
Yeah.
We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into humanitarian intervention. We'll explore the lasting impacts and the ongoing debate surrounding its legitimacy. Don't go anywhere. And for our UPSC aspirants out there, this is all gold. Pay close attention, because these are the kinds of insights that can really set you apart on exam day. We'll be back in a flash to continue our deep dive. See you soon.
See you soon.
Welcome back, everyone. We just left off talking about East Timor and how even interventions that are considered successful can have this, ripple effect of challenges for years to come. And it really got me thinking about the whole ethical dimension of this.
Oh, yeah.
Intervening in another country's affairs. I mean, it's a moral minefield, isn't it?
It really is. It's not a simple equation.
So let's wade into those thorny ethical dilemmas that come with this whole idea of humanitarian intervention.
Yeah.
It's not always a clear-cut black and white situation,
Yeah.
is it?
It's so nuanced. I mean, one of the biggest ethical dilemmas is this constant tension between the responsibility to protect human rights and the principle of state sovereignty.
Yeah.
It's like these two ideals are constantly bumping up against each other.
It's that classic question, isn't it? When does a country's right to handle its own affairs
Exactly.
take a backseat to the international community's responsibility to protect people from harm?
Yeah, where do you draw the line?
Where do you draw the line?
It's a tough one.
It is.
And there's no easy answer. And that's what makes this whole topic so complex.
Right.
And so fascinating to unpack. I mean, we're talking about fundamental principles here. Sovereignty versus human rights. It's a clash of values.
So how do we even begin to navigate this tension? Is there any kind of framework or concept that tries to reconcile these competing principles?
Well, there's this idea that's emerged, the concept of sovereignty as responsibility.
Sovereignty as responsibility.
It's an attempt to find some sort of middle ground, but it's still very much a work in progress. You know, it's not a perfect solution by any means.
So what does sovereignty as responsibility actually mean in practice? Can you kind of break it down for us?
Sure. So basically, it suggests that a country's sovereignty isn't absolute. It comes with this responsibility to protect its citizens from mass atrocities, from genocide, from ethnic cleansing, from crimes against humanity. If a state fails to uphold that responsibility, if it's either unable or unwilling to protect its own people, then the international community has a right, maybe even a duty, to step in.
Okay, so it's like a safeguard. When a state can't or won't protect its people, the international community steps in to provide that protection.
Yeah.
But who gets to decide when a state has failed in its responsibility?
Right.
And what kind of intervention is justified? I mean, does it always have to involve sending in troops?
Those are the million-dollar questions.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. There's no international consensus on this. And that's part of what makes it so tricky to navigate. The lines are blurry, and the debate often gets tangled up in issues of power dynamics. Who are the powerful players? What are their agendas? Are they really acting out of altruism? Or are there ulterior motives at play?
Right, right. And then there's the whole question of cultural differences. Can we, or should we, impose this kind of one-size-fits-all approach to human rights and governance on the entire world?
Right.
I mean, different cultures have different values, different norms, different ways of doing things.
Exactly. It's not as simple as saying, this is the right way to do things and everyone must follow our model. It's much more nuanced than that.
And of course, there's always that risk, that potential for intervention to be twisted and used for personal gain.
Oh, absolutely. The potential for abuse is always there.
I mean, we've seen it happen time and time again throughout history. Countries using the guise of humanitarian intervention to advance their own strategic interests, to secure resources, to expand their influence. It's a slippery slope.
It is. It's a real concern.
Okay, so we've got that tension between sovereignty and intervention, the lack of clear international consensus, the cultural complexities. What other ethical dilemmas do we need to grapple with?
Well, there's the problem of unintended consequences. Even when an intervention is driven by genuine humanitarian concern, there's always the risk of unforeseen negative outcomes. You go in with the best of intentions, thinking you're going to help, but then things spiral out of control, and suddenly you've made the situation worse instead of better.
That's a sobering thought. Can you give us some concrete examples of what you mean by unintended consequences, just so people can kind of wrap their heads around it?
Sure. So, for example, an intervention, even if it's aimed at bringing peace, could inadvertently destabilize a region, spark more violence and displacement, or it could create a dependency on external aid, which actually hinders a country's ability to develop its own institutions and govern itself effectively in the long run.
Right. So you're trying to help, but you end up creating a whole new set of problems. And then who's responsible for those unintended consequences?
Exactly. That's a huge question. Is it the intervening states? Is it the international community as a whole? Or is it the government of the country that's been intervened in? Who takes the blame when things go wrong? It's a moral and political minefield.
It really makes you think twice about the whole idea of intervening, doesn't it?
It does. It's not something to be taken lightly.
And, it brings up another issue that we touched on earlier, this problem of selectivity. Why do some humanitarian crises capture the world's attention and sympathy while others are almost completely ignored?
Yeah. It's one of the biggest criticisms of humanitarian intervention.
It's like there's this spotlight that shines on certain crises while others are left in the shadows, and it's hard not to wonder if there's a bias at play.
Right. Critics argue that the decision to intervene, more often than not, is driven by factors that have little to do with the actual severity of the crisis. Things like strategic interests, media coverage, cultural biases, they all play a role.
And it raises those really tough questions about fairness and equality again. Are some lives considered more worthy of protection than others?
That's the heart of it, isn't it? And it's a question we need to keep asking ourselves.
Yeah.
We need to keep challenging our assumptions and examining our own biases.
Absolutely. We can't shy away from these difficult conversations. So as we've seen, the ethical dilemmas surrounding humanitarian intervention, they're not going away anytime soon. They're as relevant and as challenging as ever.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing debate with no easy answers.
Yeah.
And it's a debate that we need to continue having because the stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about human lives, about suffering, about the responsibility to protect the most vulnerable among us. It's not something we can just ignore or sweep under the rug.
Wow, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive into humanitarian intervention. It's been a whirlwind, really. I mean, fascinating. But also
complex.
so complex to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
All the different angles, all the history.
Yeah, absolutely. From those early examples, way back when, to all the ethical challenges we're wrestling with today, humanitarian intervention, it's a topic that demands our attention and our careful consideration. It's not something we can afford to just brush aside.
No. Not at all. And I want to say to our listeners who are prepping for the UPSC exam, this stuff is crucial. Really understanding these complexities, these nuances, it can make all the difference when you're analyzing those international relations questions.
Absolutely. Doing well on the UPSC, it's not just about memorizing facts and figures.
Right.
It's about demonstrating that you can think critically, that you can look at these global issues from multiple perspectives, that you can really make a strong argument.
Exactly. So let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways, especially for our UPSC aspirants, just to kind of bring it all together. Where did we start, and what were the big milestones in this deep dive?
Okay, so we started by tracing the evolution of humanitarian intervention, going all the way back to those early ideas about natural law and the right to intervene to prevent, really horrific acts.
Right.
And then we moved into how it became much more prominent in the post-Cold War era, exploring all those factors that led to, that surge in interventions in the 1990s. We talked about overlapping interests, public pressure, the CNN effect. We also examined the challenges and the critiques that emerged, especially after 9/11 and the war on terror, which, fundamentally changed the landscape of intervention.
Yeah, it did. And we used the case of East Timor to really highlight those complexities. It's a powerful example of how even when an intervention achieves its immediate goals, stopping the violence, there are all these long-term implications and unintended consequences that we have to consider.
It's a long game. It's not a quick fix. And it's messy.
It is. And then, of course, we grappled with those really thorny ethical dilemmas.
Yeah.
The tension between state sovereignty and the responsibility to protect. The risk of those unintended consequences we talked about, and that question of selectivity.
Right.
Why do some crises seem to matter more than others?
Why do some capture the world attention and others are completely ignored?
Exactly. It's a lot to unpack, and I truly hope our listeners are walking away with this deeper, more nuanced understanding of what humanitarian intervention really is. But before we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with a final, thought-provoking question to ponder.
Okay.
This one's especially for our UPSC folks out there. How do we strike that balance, that crucial balance, between protecting human rights and respecting state sovereignty? Can we find a way to do both effectively and ethically?
That is the question, isn't it?
It's the big one.
It's the one that's going to continue to be debated in international circles for years and years to come.
That's
But I think that by engaging with these tough questions, by examining different perspectives, by really wrestling with those ethical dilemmas, we can move toward a more just and humane world. We have to try.
We do. We have to keep those conversations going.
Right.
And it's important to remember that international relations, this isn't some static field, right?
Absolutely not.
It's constantly changing and evolving, shaped by all these world events, these power shifts, the fight for human rights and dignity.
It's dynamic. And that's what makes it so fascinating. There's always something new to learn, a new challenge to confront.
For sure. So to all our listeners who are starting their UPSC journey, embrace that complexity.
Yeah.
Don't shy away from the hard questions. Dive deep. Really challenge your assumptions.
Keep learning. Keep questioning.
And never stop learning. That's key.
Yeah.
So to everyone who joined us for this deep dive, thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. And to all our UPSC aspirants out there, best of luck with your studies. Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding these global issues, that's essential for shaping a better future.
It really is. You're the future leaders, so take this knowledge and go make a difference.
And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives
Yes.
to help you on your UPSC journey.
We'll be back with more soon.
We'll be back. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.